Watch.
15 years later, I never thought I'd say this, but I think I owe Resident Evil 5 an apology. Back in 2006, the Resident Evil fan in me could not have been more excited for the next major installment in the legendary series, which reached a peak in 2005 with not only the best game in the series by far, you can fight me fixed camera RE fanboys, but the best game ever made at that time. Fast forwarding to 2024, nothing much has changed. Resident Evil 4 is still the standard nearly 20 years on. It's a game that has not aged in any significant aspect. In fact, Resident Evil 4 continues to get younger, especially considering how sloppy, derivative, and rushed games are today, releasing in near unplayable states with more attention to detail to graphics and cutscenes than actual gameplay physics and replayability. It rings true now more than ever then, how special Resident Evil 4 was in its prime time, that it managed to deliver on every essential component of game design, including some elements we had never seen before, all with state-of-the-art production values and an unforgettable narrative to boot. So naturally, the kid in me had goosebumps all over when I heard the announcement of Resident Evil 5. Not because I was scared of what would be in store in the next survival horror installment. I couldn't have been more excited to see more of Leon and Ada in their next adventure. Oh, it's Chris. And Sheva?
Shit.
Resident Evil 5 was my most anticipated game of my lifetime, other than Devil May Cry 4, which did release a year prior and met most fan expectations, including my 10-year-old's optimism. That's another game that continues to be underrated. But my optimism about video games and the world at large would soon turn to cynicism as I would turn the calendar, and Resident Evil 5 would take the brunt of my skepticism, perhaps teaching us all a lesson never to hype anything up to the max. After long years of waiting, I remember finally getting the Resident Evil 5 demo in 2009, playing it and thinking right away that something felt off. The playable section in question is simply the intro, a survival set-piece designed to rival the village welcoming party from Resident Evil 4, with a multiplied body count reaching in the dozens of extra bloodstains. It's one of many set designs modeled right out of Resident Evil 4's playbook, which on paper should not be a bad thing if all we wanted was more Resident Evil 4. But in only a few minutes of playtime, with this playable teaser for the next big thing, I got the bad feeling that Resident Evil 5 was doubling down on perhaps the most annoying sections of Resident Evil 4. The buddy system. Now, in and of itself, the escort missions in Resident Evil 4 are excellent. In fact, they might be the only good sections in a video game of such a kind, adding variety and an extra layer of tension to a game that is already as batshit and unsettling as they come. But switching my playable character to Chris and his partner to Sheva meant that I now had to play with characters that I wasn't familiar with, in a storyline that seemed divorced from everything I had hoped it would be. It sounds like an unfair criticism, but like everyone else with a sense of culture in the 2000s, I was in the Leon fan club, firmly entrenched in his team and the Resident Evil Rolodex of characters. Playing as Chris was foreign to me, and I wanted my boy back to give us some more one-liners and that suplex action. We got Chris Roydfield and boulder punching instead. Sarcasm, of course, because Chris is a solid choice for a playable character. The reality is, I wanted the same as I do now. A game that takes the Resident Evil 4 formula to the next level. There are a lot of great third-person shooters that have added some colors to the chameleon, but we still haven't come out of the shadow of the best game the genre has to offer. And the Resident Evil series has been seen by many fans as the culprit for the survival horror genre stagnating for so long, even though Silent Hill is so irrelevant that they're getting a remake too. Be like Sheva and direct the idiocy somewhere else, okay? A lot of fans are even delusional enough to blame Resident Evil 4, which is by far the best game in the series, for the so-called downfall of the series. Supposedly, Resident Evil 4 is the reason that Resident Evil 5 and 6 sucked. although the jury is still out on Resident Evil 6, when in reality it was simply the departure of Shinji Mikami to go work on Vanquish, a pretty innovative third-person shooter in and of itself actually, leaving shoes that are too big to ever fill. And the fact that Resident Evil 5 could never have lived up to the impossible expectations thrust on it by fans like me who had witnessed a gaming miracle and had gotten too high of hopes for the newly christened video game industry. Such a nasty word. Looking back on Resident Evil 5, or rather looking forward to it, I can see now that it and its design philosophy were simply misunderstood. The AI babysitting isn't merely a cumbersome holdover from the Resident Evil 4 escort sections. The partner system was an intentional mechanic introduced to make you feel like you need to survive for more than one person at a time, especially when that person is a real player that you can team up with in co-op to form a real team. Although some would argue that classic survival horror hinges on isolation and the atmosphere that loneliness creates, which are esteemed qualities that Resident Evil 5 lacks throughout. There's a case to be made that Resident Evil 5 doubling down on a high-octane pace induces a nerve-wracking and exhilarating tension for entirely different excuses than we are accustomed to having for feeling on edge. What Resident Evil 5 does poorly stands out, and what Resident Evil 5 does well can be a bit more subtle, which sounds like a dynamic that should be in reverse because it should never be easier to see the flaws than the strengths of a system, though I can see some cleverness in the subtlety of what Resident Evil 5 does right as well. It's true that Resident Evil 5 and its rigid level design feels a little old-fashioned at this point, as it maybe even did in 2009, but it also feels like it's aged appropriately for all the ways it keeps it simple, like the formula we knew and always loved does too. Resident Evil 5 retains most of the mechanical prowess that set Resident Evil 4 apart. The frantic pacing of the action sequences, strung together by split-second reaction-based QTEs that are themselves set up by pinpoint shot placement onto the terrifying targets. Inventory and resource management is scaled back and streamlined to preserve real-time action and tension, while at the same time enforcing tactics and teamwork, forcing you to share equipment amongst yourselves. Just enough ammo and herbs stretched thin to keep two players alive and well. Enemies might be even more frequent and ferocious, enough to accommodate up to 2 Monster Hunter trigger fingers. The level design is more linear, action-heavy, with slight alterations to pathways and gameplay, exploration, and even dialogue when switching between characters, accounting for a bit of randomization and differences of perspective when returning to play as the other gender. Resident Evil 5 keeps the tank controls, adds a minimap, which is helpful but reduces some of the scares of not knowing your surroundings, and lets you reload in the menu and switch between equipment with the D-pad. Every good design choice of Resident Evil 5 is an aspect of replay value, the most essential ingredient in making a good game or anything useful, and in service of maintaining the design principle of real-time strategy and survival. Although I personally prefer the inventory management that lets you pause the action and carry equipment and weapons in bulk, there is no denying that Resident Evil 5, with its preference for always keeping you on your toes, has unique and bold decision making for a sequel and for an action survival horror game. In addition to these adjustments, which cut down on what some might call time-wasting mechanics, Resident Evil 5 does everything in its power to facilitate replay value by introducing a level select, something that Resident Evil 4 didn't have, and maybe didn't need because one does not simply start Resident Evil 4 without finishing it. But almost every game should have a level select in order to allow players to return to their favorite playable sections without having to grind through the uninteresting parts to get back there. It's the principle of design that makes a game like Super Mario World or Devil May Cry 3, released simultaneously with Resident Evil 4, the most replayable games ever made because everything is self-contained, thus streamlined. Resident Evil 5 is so generous with its modifications, almost too generous to the point of making some of the replayability redundant, that it allows you to farm for items and quit out, losing the chapter progress but saving the items and treasure you've collected in a short time so that you can rinse and repeat the grind as much as you want. It's all programmed this way, I'm convinced, to cut down on the grind so that you can spend more time in the action, and above all, to facilitate one of the best co-op games ever made from the bygone golden era of multiplayer and co-op. The developers wanted it to be easier than ever to grind money and ammo so that you could take it all into the online co-op to help those in need, and to have a blast with all the potential playstyles the game has to offer in tandem with another real player. The AI is serviceable enough in Resident Evil 5 and gets a bit of a bad rap for being unresponsive, even though yes, some of the obvious criticisms are obvious, like the AI sometimes wasting your ammo and healing items when it shouldn't. But although a real player can be even worse than the AI at times, it's always more interesting to have someone with a brain take the controls. The stakes feel greater knowing that if your partner dies, or if you died, a real person has been let down. Being able to run the entire campaign with a friend or stranger and surviving the onslaught and mercenaries for high scores is the kind of addicting gameplay that is lost on the so-called modern gaming practices under the corporate sphere of influence. Back in 2009, it was really as simple as asking and receiving what we really wanted in our games. A scoreboard, a leaderboard, some player options and choices to make on our own how we want to play. The partner system does somewhat dictate the way that the game operates, which is a bit of a letdown, and some of the set pieces and boss fights in Resident Evil 5 feel like they belong in other games entirely. But Resident Evil 5 is a mixed bag of different genres, mechanics, and themes that come together in ways that cooperate more than they disagree. The game is legitimately challenging as well, with professional difficulty allowing you to die in a single hit, perhaps a difficulty spike intended to force the most synergy out of your partnership as possible. This does have a few glaring flaws, however, like in the Jill fight where the camera and button inputs can negate any attempts at healing your partner. Sometimes you even come over with the first aid spray in hand and the game just lets you die anyway. I don't really like this system in any game because it almost feels like you've been handed a death prematurely, whereas that last sliver of health shouldn't put you in a down state or kill you as much as it should leave you on 1 HP. It's a system that is as inconsistent as letting you spam saves and other times leaving you to bleed out simply because your partner is too far apart to spray your wounds. At least in Resident Evil 4, you can heal Ashley remotely from Leon's giant medical attaché case. The enemies do put up a good fight in Resident Evil 5. No one can complain about the game being too easy, even if the difficulty feels a little bullshit at times. Getting S ranks in missions offers bonus unlock points and leaderboard positions to further incentivize replaying the game. I do feel like treasure hunting and item collecting isn't nearly as rewarding as it was in 4, what with the ability to combine treasures and sell every single item collected for some value. Ammo has almost no resale value in Resident Evil 5, but I guess that's because they want you to stock up on it for when you need it the most. Unless you play with infinite ammo and want to say, to hell with strategy. It's cool to have infinite ammo available for every weapon, although it somewhat cheapens the experience if every single gun makes you into a superhero. I value player choice as one of the most important aspects of design, so I'll allow it. Why not let the player go nuts? There's enough balance in one-hit deaths to make up for it. Now, despite some lackluster level design, focused on linearity with little to no backtracking outside of level select, and a plot that sounds more grand on paper than it is in its execution, the core combat cannot be disputed. Even if some of the QTEs were more gnarly and physically impactful in Resident Evil 4, how Wesker could be so OP as the AI but feel so weak as the player character is kind of inexcusable. Tons of set pieces are recycled from Resident Evil 4, as well as some enemies, with none of them being quite as intriguing as what 4 has to offer, except for the chainsaw guy, who can surprise you by getting back up after you think he's dead. This really pissed me off when it happened to me, but now I can really appreciate it. What a nice touch. And don't forget about he who wears his sunglasses at night, the man from the Matrix, Albert Wesker. But even Wesker played better in Resident Evil 4, and his mysterious aura made him even more menacing. Calmly directing orders from his throne in a shady control room, Wesker was always in control behind the scenes, making more of an impact from the shadows than he could have ever made coming into the light. He's still a great villain that's formidable in cutscenes as much as he is in combat, feeling more like a Metal Gear Solid boss puzzle than a Resident Evil bullet sponge enemy. I can't help but thinking, though, that Capcom's writers let him down by making him into a cartoon villain by the end. He has a few moments of intriguing lore that humanizes him, but he paradoxically needed more scenes to flesh out his motivations and to preserve his mystery, rather than the in-game cram we get where he monologues himself to death in moments that he could have ended Chris and Sheva in his sleep. Now, in terms of gameplay, the AI Wesker feels like Wesker. With eyes in the back of his head, he's able to zip around like a bothersome fly, dodging bullets from all directions, and cross-map knocking Chris and Sheva into next week. This man catches and holds an RPG rocket in his hands and crumples it up like a piece of paper. The best thing about Wesker is that he knows how to dish it as well as he can take it. Bullying Wesker is no small feat, but if you can manage to sneak in some melee combos on him, it's worth the beating that he gives you in return. Capcom really made it so the players could push that button and do the unthinkable to the great man. The Revenge of the Sith-inspired showdown is about as satisfying and epic a send-off as Wesker deserves, even if the build-up to it was somewhat forgettable by comparison to the dastardly bastards of Resident Evil 4. And the boss fight itself is kind of dumb, even with the boulder punching aside. All he does is flail his arms around, letting you one-hit RPG him from behind, or you can do the tag team finisher, which is kind of cool. I think that, at least thematically, Wesker's really just one of those villains that is more of a myth than the man can live up to be. I like him a lot, but he ain't a Virgil.
You're not worthy as my opponent.
15 years later, for all of its flaws and failure to meet the impossible standards set by Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5 does a lot very well. So rightly, it should not have been written off by me or others. As it stands, it's the highest selling title in the series, so a big chunk of the Resident Evil community has spoken in favor of RE5, so it would seem. A multiplayer game is defined by more than anything its players. Resident Evil 5 still has fans coming back to play a few matches in 2024, which was the plan all along. If Resident Evil 4 Remake seeks to justify the ways that Resident Evil 4 could have been supposedly improved in its core formula, Resident Evil 5 does some things to justify all of those original design choices from the get-go, and to do a few things differently without deviating entirely from the precision-based survival combat. If, or I should say when, the inevitable Resident Evil 5 remake comes around, there are a few things that Capcom could polish. But after playing Resident Evil 5 for the first time 15 years later, I'm confident that Resident Evil 5 holds its own as a good game that doesn't need a remake, just to shoehorn mechanics that didn't need to be there in the first place. Like they did with Resident Evil 4 Remake. As much as I came around to enjoying Resident Evil 4 Remake at the time, I haven't forgiven Capcom, and I will not, for shamelessly removing Remake from the title and logo, as if to diminish and replace the original, passing off their lack of originality Remake as something entirely new and unseen before. It's a crime that we now have to refer to the original in a redundant manner of speaking as Resident Evil 4 2005. At least Atlas has the decency and respect to label Persona 3 Reload as a remake but in stylized form. I think I speak for everyone when I say that what we need next is Resident Evil 9, and we need to let the old games live. At least the ones that hold up like Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil is a great series when you play the right versions of the right games, a series well deserving of that global saturation.
Will be released into the atmosphere, ensuring complete global saturation.